Ready to go.
Good morning, Richard, and good morning to members and friends of the Toronto Humanist Association. I was delighted to receive the invitation from Richard to talk with you today about my book on George Holyoake. And especially I'm grateful that you would take time out on a nice summer morning to be in front of your computer. Now, about the book, I'll show you the book cover because there are two firsts that I claim for this book. First, that it is the only modern biography of George Holyoake. The previous definitive biography was published in 1922. And of course, we have a lot of additional information and perspective today. So I think it's well worthwhile to have a modern biography. The other thing is that, and as I show you the picture, there were no photographs of Holyoake in middle age, only as an elderly man. So I commissioned a painter to create an impression of what he would have looked like based on his elder photos at about the age of 40. So we call that George Holyoake at 40 an impression. Now, as Richard mentioned, I'm coming to you from Kingston, but I speak as a refugee from Toronto. I came here to Kingston about 10 years ago after 40 years in the big smoke. And I haven't been back since the pandemic, but I'm looking forward to getting there later this summer. Now, George Jacob Holyoake is most famously known for having invented the word secularism and for his efforts in advancing the two great social movements of Victorian England, secularism and the cooperative movement. Holyoake was born in 1817 in Birmingham, England, at a time when Britain was still recovering from the Napoleonic Wars. His life spanned the reign of Queen Victoria. He died at the age of 88 in 1906, 5 years to the day after the death of Queen Victoria. An era had ended. Holyoake was hailed as one of the grand old men of Britain. I thought today I might tell you some of the reasons why I wrote this biography and where I think we stand with secularism and humanism in the 21st century. I decided to write Inventing Secularism because of the astonishing and appalling attacks on our democratic and secular rights that we're seeing right now. They're coming from religious factions backed by populist and autocratic regimes around the world. I see the book as a way of defending one of the greatest movements in world history, the shift to independent thought, scientific inquiry, and free thought that came with secularism. Holyoake lived through a period of great religious turmoil in the United Kingdom. People were abandoning the churches, especially the Church of England. Only 1/4 of the population were regular churchgoers. Holyoake was a radical social reformer. He had a ringside seat and played a leading role, as Richard mentioned, in every social cause: universal suffrage, trade union rights, women's rights, open Sundays, secular education, you name it, and Holyoake was there. But today, he's unknown to the general public. It's my hope my book will go at least a little way toward correcting that. Holyoake was raised in a devout Christian home. He said his father was a pagan, but his mother had enough religion for both of them. He taught Sunday school in his hometown of Birmingham, but he recognized early on the inequalities of Victorian society. An early turning point for Holyoake came when, at the age of 12, his sister died after money they'd saved for her care had to be handed over to the Church of England to meet the Easter tithe. At that, the rector kept Eleanor Holyoake waiting 5 hours before he'd accept her money. This helped to turn Holyoake into a rebellious young man. He was attracted to the ideas of Robert Owen, the Welsh-born capitalist turned socialist who denounced all organized religion as frauds. Holyoake became a social missionary for Holyoake's Society of Religious Rationalists. I wonder how you can be rational about any aspect of religion. However, Owen had a utopian vision to establish worker-owned and run communities. But the two that he did manage to set up in New Harmony in the United States and Queenwood in England both failed. George Holyoake would have been I think, a borderline agnostic, but for the imprisonment of his friend and colleague, Charles Southwood, on a charge of blasphemy. Southwood was editor of an atheist paper, The Oracle of Reason, a great name. He satirized the Bible as a Jew book. He was jailed not for anti-Semitism, but for calling the Bible a monstrous book filled with lust, sodomies, and slaughterings. Southwell's jailing for a year made an atheist of Holyoake. Holyoake told his flock in Sheffield that I flee the Bible as a viper and revolt at the touch of a Christian. After making a speech in Cheltenham in the west of England, Holyoake told a questioner that he did not believe in God. For saying that, he was sent to prison for 6 months for blasphemy. He came out determined to bring an end to religion's control over daily life. It didn't take long for Holyoake to realize that atheism was an unacceptable term in the England of his day. It was a word associated with indecency and immorality. A new term was needed. Holyoake was familiar with the term secular, not holy, worldly, and in a flash of insight in 1851, the word secularism came to him. Now today we're familiar with many isms, but for Holyoake in his time, to add that suffix ism and make it secularism was truly an original thought. As he has explained, secularism would be a system for implementing the principle of separation of church and state. Secularism would remove religious dogma from the public sphere from education, the courts, and lawmaking. Government would follow a hands-off policy toward religion, treating it as a private matter outside of public life. Secularism would be a way, Holyoake wrote, of promoting human welfare by material means. He added, when the priest is master, inquiry is sharply reduced. Despite Holyoake's coining secularism, the man who founded the National Secular Society in 1866 was Charles Bradlaugh, Holyoake's younger and more charismatic rival. How did the relationship between Holyoake and Bradlaugh develop during their lives? What impact did the relationship have on the development of secularism in Britain in the 19th century? The rivalry between Holyoake and Bradlaugh makes for one of the most contentious chapters of their lives. Bradlaugh was younger, more vigorous, and it must be admitted, more charismatic than Holyoake. He was also a better organizer. Holyoake's efforts to organize a secular society went almost nowhere, partly because he was distracted by other causes, especially the cooperative movement. Ironically, Holyoake had introduced Bradlaugh the first time Bradlaugh spoke at a public meeting. Bradlaugh was young at the time, only 18, and obnoxious. After Holyoake closed his radical paper, The Reasoner, Bradlaugh started up another, The National Reformer. The two tried working together, but it wasn't to be. Disagreement was inevitable. Bradlaugh's insistence on atheism clashed with Holyoake's willingness to accept people of faith into secularism as long as they left their religion in the church or at home. In 1870, Holyoake and Bradlaugh held a debate over 2 nights in which they argued over whether secularism required an underlying commitment to atheism. Bradlaugh argued that it should and did, and Holyoake that it did not. Now, we might ask ourselves a couple of questions at this point. How far did Holyoake's attitude toward religion soften in later years? And how far did his views evolve in contrast to or opposition to Bradlaugh's? Holyoake attacked Bradlaugh for weakening secularism. He criticized what he saw as the movement's poverty of resources. He criticized what he saw in Holyoake, in Bradlaugh's continued emphasis and insistence on atheism. Holyoake regarded keeping clear of atheism as the first duty of a secularist. Both men made efforts to bridge the gap. Bradlaugh offered Holyoake a vice presidency in the National Secular Society, but Holyoake declined, although 6 years later he finally accepted the post, but he never was active in that position. When Bradlaugh died in 1891, Holyoake gave a fulsome apology, eulogy. He was the most illustrious fighting propagandist ever seen, Holyoake said. Many notable people attended Bradlaugh's funeral. A crowd of 2,000 was present. Among them was a young man from India studying in London, name of Mahatma Gandhi. For all that Holyoake criticized Christianity, he was always respectful toward individual Christian ministers. He went out of his way to hear sermons whenever he was on tour and when he visited the United States and Canada. You might ask, what was Holyoake like as a person? What were his strengths and weaknesses? Well, I think he was a little shy, a little withdrawn, and probably socially conservative in his personal lifestyle. Holyoake had his flaws, as we all do, but he didn't abuse his staff, cheat his investors, or beat his wife. He was a caring father, a considerate husband, and he never asked his wife's religious views, although he never made any secret of his own. Holyoake had a powerful sense of humor. He was a great satirist. He made light of his circumstances, whether he found himself in a flea-infested prison cell or in a bedbug-ridden room of a cheap hotel. George Holyoake was a realist. He saw the world as it was and set out to change it. His chief flaw was his failure to focus on one issue at a time. He admits he tried to crowd too many ideas into his speeches. He took up every cause that came his way: European revolutions, open Sundays, the stamp tax on newspapers, put there to make them so expensive the working class couldn't afford to buy them. And of course, he supported universal suffrage, the co-op movement. He claimed he owed £600,000 in stamp tax and offered to pay it off at a shilling a week. He was rescued from that when, as a result of many years of campaigning, the stamp tax was abolished. Holyoake's chief strength, it is clear, was his principled dedication to improving the lives of his fellow man. He was widely known, first and foremost, even before he invented secularism, as a radical farm journalist. He wrote 2 million words that went into 160 pamphlets and books in the promotion of his ideas. Through it all, he suffered ill health, temporary blindness, malnutrition, and a shortage of coin of the realm. But Holyoake was not afraid of death. He who knows how to live will know how to die, he wrote. Let's look for a moment to the legacy that George Holyoake left Britain and the world. To begin, I think it's safe to say the average Briton, like the average Canadian, is today a secularist or humanist. More than half of the population in Britain identify themselves as having no religion. I think the figure is about a third for Canada. And in the UK, only 12% now affirm support of the Church of England. That's down from 40% in 1983. Most of the old barriers against free thought have fallen in higher education, the professions, politics, business. Holyoake was a Republican, but he never made much noise on the issue of abolishing the monarchy. But as we all know, the trappings of a pre-secular society are still strong in both the United Kingdom and Canada today. The monarchy, the Queen's role as head of both the Church of England and head of state. And in England, Anglican bishops are sitting in the House of Lords, and religious instruction is still a requirement in state schools. As a Canadian and a subject of the Queen, I believe it's time to rethink the whole principle of the monarchy. More than 100 countries now commit themselves to secularism. But in many respects, secularism is under siege. Its future threatened by autocratic leaders and their populist movements that are working to undermine the liberal democracies fostered by secularism around the world. In the United States, despite the change of presidency, a country where religion has always played a significant role in politics, the Christian evangelists of the right are pushing to have their ideas written into the laws of the land. Rights are being restricted: the right to voting, the right to freedom of choice for women, the right to share in equality of lives by blacks and other persons of color. Discrimination on the grounds of religious belief is being upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. It's permitting businesses to refuse service, doctors to reject patients, and public agencies to withhold services to gays, transgenders, and others with religious or irreligious views of which they disapprove. In Europe, countries like Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, once staunchly secularist, are losing freedoms to autocratic regimes. Turkey's historic museums, like the Hagia Sophia, are being converted to mosques. From the Vatican, Pope Francis is warning his flock of the alleged dangers of secularism. India, an inheritor of secularism from the days of the British Empire, is abandoning religious neutrality in public life and imposing strict Hindu practices on its polyglot population. China, with a constitution that speaks of freedom of religion, is engaged in a massive campaign of repression of its Muslim minority. In some other countries, secularism has become the source of political controversy. In France, because of its insistence on the integration of its Muslim population, a policy that I believe will never work, is having serious difficulties. Better, it should try multiculturalism, the Canadian model, which respects the presence of a minority while ensuring it has the opportunity to share in the privileges of the majority. multiculturalism has succeeded in Canada, a country that is now a nation of immigrants. Secularism is so taken for granted in our daily life that few in English Canada give it a second thought. Only in French-speaking Quebec is there controversy over secularism. Its version, like that of France, regulates the dress of public servants. No woman who wears the hijab can ever be a judge in Quebec or occupy any other position of public authority. A step too far in the view of many. I'm reminded of this every evening when I see on CBC television a young woman wearing a hijab hosting the evening news program. But in fact, Canada, with the exception of Quebec, has been a laggard in adopting secularism. At the time of Confederation in 1867, the principles of secularism were well known to statesmen across the Western world. These principles were almost completely ignored by the fathers of the Confederation. Their focus was on promoting harmony between French and English Canada, between two religious forces, Catholicism and Protestantism. And the qualities that most distinguished the two were, of course, language and religion. In the interest of peace, order, and good government, it was agreed that French-speaking Canadians would keep their language and civil law, and that their schools would remain Catholic institutions. It was also put into the Constitution that Catholic schools in the Northwest Territories, later in Alberta and Ontario, would continue to be run by the church and would be publicly funded with the taxes of Catholic ratepayers going to the schools. That situation still exists today. It's estimated of about $6 billion a year at a cost of public funds. And religious schools are not the only sector that receives public funding in Canada. More than 3,000 religious charities benefit from giving tax reductions to donors. The Centre for Inquiry Canada estimates that costs some $3 billion a year. As well, church properties are exempt from municipal taxes, another billion a year of lost tax revenue. According to the BC Humanist Association, the clergy residence deduction deprives government of about $100 million a year in tax revenue. Finally, religious organizations receive about $1 billion a year in government grants for good works, to be sure, but also in the interest of, quote, advancing the cause of religion. I'm not sure that's a cause that warrants taxpayer money. So altogether, that's some $5 to $6 billion a year that the country could well direct to other purposes. But that's not all. The great tragedy of Canadian history, the residential schools for Indigenous children, came about in large part from Canada's failure to adopt secular education. And it's not as if the fathers of Confederation didn't know what they were doing. When George Holyoake visited Canada in 1882, he met Sir John A. Macdonald in Ottawa, and the two had lunch together. Holyoake would have talked up secularism. Yet 2 years later, the residential schools were established under the management and control of the Catholic and Anglican churches. Imagine the difference if these schools had been operated by qualified teachers reporting to their respective lay departments of education. Abuses would have likely occurred, and the aim of the schools to take the Indian out of the child would have been the same. But we might not today be searching for forgotten graves of these children if their schools had not been under church control. Humanists, I think, should be speaking out on all of these issues. There'll be the opportunity to do so during the federal election campaign, not so far away, and in Ontario in next year's provincial election. A good opportunity to ask politicians by surveys and personal contact where they stand on these issues. Make them aware there are disgruntled constituents out there. Now, finally, I'd like to say something of George Holyoake's vision of the future. He looked beyond his own time, confident that in his words, secularist principles involve for mankind a future. It would be a future of moral as well as material good. As he wrote, offering an infinite diversity of intellect with equality among humanity. With, he added, all things, noble society, the treasures of art, and the riches of the world to be had in common. George Holyoake's vision rings today more true than ever. He would deplore the way we're waging war on nature and plundering our environment. It's not too late to rededicate ourselves to the idea that one's first duty is to their fellow citizen rather than to the accumulation of wealth for wealth's sake. Well, I hope that gives you something of a picture of the man George Holyoake, and I'll turn it back to Richard. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ray, for that presentation today about George Jacob Holyoake. Could everyone please take yourself off mute and give George or give Ray a really big round of applause for his presentation today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. Now, before you grace us with a reading from your new book, I'm just going to give you a bit of a break here and maybe bring up some of the tensions that I see that are fascinating to me because of the fact that certainly when you look at humanism and of course secularism, there's all these tensions that go back and forth, and I think George was certainly experiencing a lot of those in his life. There was the idea of whether that secularism was actually a philosophy unto itself, or whether it was a kind of a separate to a philosophy. So was it an alternative to religion? Is that where we were going there? There's something that was would provide a kind of a philosophical boundary, Or was it an ethical program of moral guidance? Again, sort of contrary to what religion was. Or was this a movement that encompassed all people, religious and otherwise, in ability to be, in a movement, I suppose, to better man's life on the planet, as opposed, and that people could consider the afterworld if they wanted to, but their primary duty was to the present. So I think he had a big tension there of whether to keep it small and elite, which I think was his preference, and maybe more easily governed by someone with a limited organizational means, or whether it was something that he needed to press on everybody to take on the role of secularist, even if they be religious as well. So there was that. So a mass movement or an elite movement. And then the idea, I think that he was a very rational man, an intellectual man. He certainly seemed to be a great materialist, but did he appeal to the emotional side? Was he satisfying the emotional side of the people that he was talking to? And maybe that was a deficit in his movement, that he wasn't appealing to that other emotional side as well. And maybe that's what Bradlaugh was kind of thinking needed to be done to actually make this a movement that would be, stand the test of time. And the last thing, I guess, is whether it was a practical or principled approach. So on the one side, he was obviously an atheist because of the way he described. He could almost just be described as an anti-theist in his approach to Christianity and the Bible, etc. But at the same time, he was a practical man and a realist. So you could see that his movement was definitely one of saying, well, if we're going to be anything but a small niche player in this, we have to appeal to all types of people, whether they be atheist or not, and that the term atheist is going to take a lot of rehabilitation to get past the stereotype that was present in society then, and that 100 years on is still very much a feature of atheism, even though so much work has been done to rehabilitate the term. So that practical versus a principled approach. So it's funny that he was wrestling with all these things as a humanist and a secularist at the time. And again, 100 odd years later, we've still got the same problems and still got those same philosophical differences in the movement that he helped to sustain. So yeah, those are just some of my thoughts on the idea. We're going to have time for a bit of Q&A. Ray, how much time have you got this morning after you do the reading? Have you got a few minutes to answer some questions?
Indeed, I do. I'm in your hands. And
Okay.
may I say, Richard, that
Yeah.
those are most perceptive remarks that you've made. In the book, I mentioned that when after George Holyoake invented secularism, he wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And the debate went on for a number of years. But I think Holyoake's emphasis was on what we would call political secularism. His position was that as long as one was prepared to leave religion outside of the public square, they were welcome to be as part of the grand movement of secularism. I see secularism as a broad main stream into which we can all swim, while leaving on shore our religious prejudices and views, and ensuring that the public square is not subject to religious control in any shape or manner. Now, I thought I would do a short reading from the book, not so much about secularism, but about George Holyoake's visits to the United States and Canada, which were most interesting experiences. He made two trips in 1879 and in 1882. In support of trying to get the governments of the United States and Canada to publish guidebooks to help English immigrants succeed when they reach their new homes. So I will read from a portion of chapter 19, which I entitle "An Innocent in America Finds the Ties That Bind." George Holyoake naively trusted the Canadian and American governments to do his bidding in the preparation of guidebooks that would educate prospective immigrants on matters as diverse as land to be had by purchase or by homestead, the climate, conditions of health, markets for labor, all things enabling, in his words, an immigrant to go out with his eyes open. In neither Washington nor Ottawa were officials easily convinced to take on such a project. Holyoake found himself a 62-year-old innocent in America, a mirror image of Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad, both recounting experiences in unfamiliar lands at approximately the same time. Both traveled as America was entering the Gilded Age of Twain's fevered imagination, a period when the post-Civil War United States turned its attention from freeing, but not liberating, its slaves to pushing Indians out of its most valuable Western lands while building a new industrial colossus. France would call the time La Belle Époque, and Britain would know it simply as the Victorian Age, a turning point when Holyoake's secularist propagandizing and cooperative advocacy would help change the thinking of millions. Now, I'll find my next point where we go on. Holyoake never allowed his secular convictions to prevent him from visiting churches and mixing with ministers. He had no choice on his first ship to America when he took a third-class cabin and was double bunked with the Reverend James J. Good of Philadelphia, who was returning from the Holy Land. There were 12 clergymen on board, which was fine with Holyoake because he was sure if anything went wrong with him, they would use friendly intercession in the quarter where they had influence and get it all put right. He gave his first speech to a church congregation at the Free Church of Florence, Massachusetts, to a group of Sunday school teachers. He remembered he had been one himself. He spoke many times in churches and found the piety of the worshipers simple and fearless. They did not, as we do in England, pay any attention to what people thought of them. They did me the honor to believe that it was impossible that I could abuse their trust. Now, of all the American cities Holyoake visited, New York, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Las Vegas, he was most impressed with Washington. the most superb in its brilliant flashes of space. He added, Washington is the only city I have ever seen which no wanton architect or builder can despoil. Holyoake got a first-hand view of American politics in Washington, where he was led about by Colonel Robert Ingersoll, celebrated freethinker known as the Great Agnostic. They had admired each other from a distance. They were each other's English and American counterparts. They shared common views on the great issues of the day: religion, slavery, women's rights, birth controls, and were both persuasive writers who sprinkled their works, as well as their talks, with humor, anecdote, and calls to action. George Holyoake's daughter, Emily Ashurst Holyoake, kept kept close to his side on his second visit to North America in 1882. She was motivated either on account of her father's health or her own desire to see the New World. Prime Minister Gladstone, appreciative of Holyoake's support, assigned him a £100 grant. They passed by Niagara Falls, the maddest of all waterfalls and cataracts ever known, on their entry into Canada. Holyoake was much impressed with the College of Agriculture they visited in Guelph, but was taken aback when an eminent editor told him there was no need for a settler's guide because everything a settler needed to know had already been written up. In Toronto, Holyoake and Emily met Professor Goldwin Smith, an English-born academic who was regarded as Canada's leading public intellectual of the day. He was a leader of the Canada First movement, which, belying its name, advocated union with the United States. Holyoake found Smith at the Grange, a fine stone home and the most English manorial home I had seen in that country or America. Quaint, strong, and capacious, with endless dark paneled rooms, bright with paintings and with other signs of historic opulence. The highlight of their visit to Ottawa was a luncheon with Premier Sir John A. Macdonald, the hard-drinking, high-living head of the Canadian government. Brought to Canada as a child from Scotland, he built a law practice in Kingston, Ontario, and played a leading role in the Confederation of British Colonies into the new Dominion of Canada. One day, Holyoake records, Sir John made some remarks which threw more light on European conceptions of Canada than any other I heard. He said artists were the defamers of Canada. They all paint the snows, the sledges and ice, and the people in furs. The ripened fruit, magical vines, the golden harvests, the forests, the flowers, the splendid rivers and glories of tropical seasons the great land has, we never see painted, Macdonald said. Macdonald turned Holyoake over to J.H. Pope, the Minister of Agriculture. Pope took up the idea of the Settler's Guidebook, and assigned John Lowe, his chief secretary, to the writing of it. It was published a few months later, and Holyoake personally received 400 requests for copies. The final stages of Holyoake's second North American visit took he and Emily to the American Southwest and the land of the rapidly vanishing Old West. On the way, they visited Kansas City, where Holyoake's good luck ran with him. He was invited on a torrid day to visit a cooperative sugar bakery. Interrupted by an invitation to go for a drive, he found on his return that the bakery had collapsed, burying 5 people in its ruins. Holyoake came away with a somewhat superficial impression of the lives of the Mexican peon class of the region, descendants of Spanish Indian natives who had filled the region before it was annexed by the United States. He envied the Mexican woodcutter, who takes 3 days to cut his wood in the most romantic dells in the universe. He loads his asses in the morning sun, spends a day in roadless gorges, takes another day in the quaint, sunny city of Santa Fe, selling his bundles. With money in hand, he buys a pint of whiskey, of quality very doubtful, the backbones of a couple of sheep, some coffee or pepper, or some other spice. He does no more work while those provisions last. Other Mexicans rear goats and drive them at leisure 100 miles to market. Holyoake thought, God preserve them from civilization. So those are a few highlights of his travels in North America.
Thank you very much, Ray. Certainly, I don't know if those apprehensions of his of Mexican peon life seem to be as idyllic as he was presenting them. It sounds like a man who has never cut wood or driven it to market for 100 miles to me. But that's nonetheless a fantastic, and I would have loved to have heard his recollections, and perhaps I'll save that for the book of what did Vegas look like in the late 1800s. So that would have been quite an amazing sight. Well, again, before I'd like to just thank sort of Ray Argyle, certainly for presenting us the topic today and introducing us to the radical life of George Jacob Holyoake, his philosophy and why he was a secular man of all seasons, relevant to his time and to our present time as well. Certainly, if you're interested in Ray's book, Inventing Secularism, The Radical Life of George Jacob Holyoake, is available at any of your fine booksellers. I imagine on Amazon. It's available in softcover, hardcover, ebook. And of course, if you're a library goer, please check in with your local library. And if it's not there, make a request. Those requests can go a long way to providing distribution of such an important book and make it accessible to everybody, which would be certainly in line with George Jacob's philosophy of presentation of information to the masses and not having that be any impediment to the spread of good knowledge. So again, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for attending today. And I will now end the recording and we'll go to the Q&A.